Shabbat part 2. In this lesson, we're going to pick up verse by verse through Matthew 12, verses 1 through 14, and also portions of Mark and Luke. If you missed part 1, you might want to go back and check that out, as it provides a context for better understanding the so-called Sabbath controversies. I'll go ahead and reset our problem, and then we're going to be Bereans as we go through the passage to see if these things be so. So the problem is the Gospels clearly portray Jesus and the disciples as violating the Sabbath rules. Now, a lot of people would say, well, that is because grace came here to replace the outdated law. That unfortunately doesn't cut it, because breaking the Sabbath in the absence of a legal exception, we talked about this in part 1, is a very serious sin. In extreme forms, it could carry the death penalty. So to say that grace came here to replace the law, well, grace is never a license to sin. And if they didn't have an excuse, they were definitely sinning when they picked the grain in the grain field. Romans 6:1 says, "What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? God forbid." So we have this very clear statement in here in Romans and several other places that we don't use our grace as an opportunity to sin. And I don't believe for a moment that that is what Jesus was doing here. So if we play this out, accusing Jesus of any sin, but specifically this sin, means that if it's true, he can't be the Messiah and he can't be our Savior because he wasn't sinless. And to that I would also say, God forbid. We know that he is from God, though. He is sinless. He is the Messiah, and therefore he is our Savior. Therefore, I'm telling you, he had to keep the Sabbath. It's a non-starter to argue any other position. So we have to dig a little bit deeper to find out what is going on. Now let's go verse by verse. Matthew 12, verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain. Lest there be any question, Luke makes it clear that not only did they harvest it, they also threshed, because Luke says they rubbed them in their hands, and that was to remove the outer chaff to get to the kernel inside. And so, like we mentioned previously, just because they didn't use tools for harvesting doesn't mean they didn't harvest. They used their hands. And so, as we said in part 1, this is not a man-made fence the disciples are accused of violating. That's the other main argument, was that, well, he didn't come to, abolish the Torah. He just came to tear down these man-made walls. Actually, that's not true in this case. Exodus 34:21, you shall work 6 days, but on the seventh day you shall rest, even during plowing time and harvest. So there's no excuse. The prohibition on harvesting comes straight from the Torah in Exodus 34. We aren't told why they did this, and so first question is why? What were the circumstances? We just want to know more. But the Bible is often like this; it doesn't tell us everything we might want to know. So therefore, we're left to speculate and infer. And I tend to think that maybe they had a long journey on a Friday and found themselves, outside of a city as the sun went down on Friday night, and then they had no prospects for food for 24 hours. From the context, we don't necessarily get the sense that they're at risk of literally starving to death, which I think in that case, if they had been near death, then few people would have argued that, yes, it's okay, you could eat in that circumstance. But it had to be something more than just chomping on some seeds in between meals for Jesus to permit violating Exodus 34. So I think it's somewhere in between. They were really, really hungry. And this was, I wouldn't say an emergency, but it was urgent that they had some food. Now, when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath." And this picture shows how pervasive the wascally fallacy is in our Christian materials, because you see the disciples off in the distance walking through a field, and then this group of spies, they'll say, look what they're doing. Again, the text says nothing about sneaking up or setting a trap, so I encourage you to fight the urge to always assume that they're up to no good and that they have bad intentions. And that approach is something we should do with each other, by the way. We always want others to give us the benefit of the doubt, but we tend to judge people by their motives. And so let's all give each other the benefit of the doubt. Let's practice that. I believe actually these Pharisees had to be followers of Jesus. Perhaps they were fully committed, perhaps they were curious, but they were part of this crowd that was following on that day. Because only Jesus' followers would have been with him. Everyone else would have been either with their families or in the synagogue observing the Shabbat. So the fact that these guys are with Jesus, I think they were traveling with him at this time. So here's a very important question. Even if the Pharisees were there with bad intentions, we need to ask, was their concern legitimate? And I would say, you bet it was. We've already seen that this is a clear violation of Exodus 34:21. It's not a man-made rule. So this was not a false accusation. In fact, I think everyone in that present on that time should have been questioning whether this was acceptable. If a parent allowed their child to do something illegal, would it not be a legitimate concern to raise the issue? So in that sense, the Pharisees had an obligation to bring up the disciples' violation of the Sabbath. What's going on here? We need to. This is really, really wrong, and we need to find out kind of more. What say you, kind of thing. Jesus, of course, answers with Scripture, just like he did in the wilderness. He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, and he and his companions, how he entered the house of God, how they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone." This is a story that comes from 1 Samuel 21, and I've got one snippet, but it's worth reading the whole section, the first few verses in 1 Samuel 21. "The priest answered David and said, 'There is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread. If only the young men have kept themselves from women.'" And that's a whole very interesting comment, that last line about keeping yourselves clean. We'll have to get into that some other time. It would derail our study here. Leviticus 24 talks about the consecrated bread. "For Aaron and his sons, they shall eat it in a holy place. It is most holy to them. It is the Lord's offering by fire, his portion forever." So we may tend to think that the David incident took place on a Sabbath, and Jesus is drawing his approval from this story. Not quite. This story there's nothing about the Sabbath in this story. It could have been the day that they swapped the bread out, but we aren't really told what day of the week this is when David was hungry. Now the trick is that no one was supposed to eat the bread besides the priest, no matter what day it was. So Jesus is saying just the general exception plays. If someone is in need, then we can bend, we can override some rules here. This is a piece of furniture that was in the tabernacle, and this is from the tabernacle model that's located in the south of Israel and near a town called Elat, and it's called Timnah Park. As you can see, there were 12 loaves here, just as Leviticus says. They were divided into 6 and 6, and the bread was exchanged each Sabbath day. So even though the bread was supposed to be set apart, David provided an improved exception in an unusual circumstance. So perhaps Jesus' defense here might have something to do with invoking an improved exception. We talked about that in part 1. Basically, he's saying human need is greater than temple procedures or tabernacle procedures. Now, this one maybe is more difficult for us Gentiles to follow, which could be why only Matthew included it and Mark and Luke did not. "Have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple violate the Sabbath and yet are innocent?" So there are a number of activities that occur on a Sabbath day, and these are listed partially here in Numbers 28, 9, and 10. And then on a Sabbath day, 2 male lambs, 1-year-old without defect, 2/10 of an ephah of flour, etc., etc. They also do things like circumcisions are done on Shabbat because it's more important to remember the covenant than it is to refrain from work. So it's more important to God here that the priestly work in the temple continue despite any Shabbat restrictions. So even if a baby's born on a Friday, and the date of the circumcision lands on a Shabbat, the circumcision continues despite the restriction of work. So certain things, we have a rule, and then certain things we have exceptions for. So in this case, temple procedures are greater than Shabbat prohibitions, and I think that's Jesus' point here. But I say to you, something greater than the temple is here. It actually provides a big clue, I believe, to Jesus' argument. "But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion rather than sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent." He's referencing Hosea 6:6, which also he referenced at the banquet that Matthew held. "For I desire loyalty rather than sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than burnt offering." So human need of the disciples is greater than the temple service, which is greater than the Shabbat prohibitions. I think that is his argument argument, going back to that A is greater than B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. So human need is greater than all of these things and can provides a valid exception for Shabbat. So on the surface, the two stories have nothing to do with each other, but I think Jesus is making this argument here, connecting the threads together. He's not violating Torah. He's actually upholding Torah to the highest possible standard, and he's going to get to that in verse 8. So, kind of to sum it up, here is the hypothesis we brought forth in part 1. So Jesus is invoking a valid exception, the preservation of life, acts of compassion. That's our ambulance that is speeding in going 80 in a 45 zone. If A, compassion and human need, is greater than temple service, and temple service, B, is greater than Shabbat prohibitions against work, then, therefore, human need is greater than the Sabbath prohibitions against work. And so that's where he's drawing us in Matthew 12, 4, 5, and 6. So hungry David overrides temple rules override Shabbat. Then the hungry disciples harvesting grain, which he says is greater than the temple is here, that overrides the Shabbat prohibition. So I think this makes sense. This kind of reconciles everything, and it leaves Jesus not as a Sabbath breaker, but one who knows every detail of the law and will uphold it perfectly and brings things back to the way they were intended to be. So Hosea 6:6 is not saying that the sacrificial system is bad. The Father developed it and instituted it. So how can anything from the Father be bad? Jesus actually authenticates it when he says that it's more important than the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a blessing. God gave it to us, and we need to treat any gift from God with care. But it's our hearts that are bad when we put rules and do's and don'ts, that we put them above loving God with our whole hearts and loving neighbor as ourselves. And again, we can point the finger at the Pharisees for not seeing this, but let's also look in the mirror. These lessons are for us today as much as they are for those living 2,000 years ago. We build fences around the good things of God, and we let our rules get in the way of love and compassion. Mark 12:33 actually paraphrases Hosea 6:6 in a way that I think is truer to what Jesus' intent is here. And to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. So again, we have this much more than. So we all have times in our lives where our priorities are misplaced, and we put duty, whatever form that takes, we put that above loving and serving others. But Mark 12:33 reminds us to keep everything in check. Concern for human beings and alleviation of human suffering need to be placed ahead of ceremonial concerns. The Sabbath is truly a blessing, but certain situations take priority over keeping the Sabbath and doing no work. It's fascinating that a very similar argument, which similar to the one Jesus just did about saving a life on Shabbat, actually appears in the Jewish Talmud. And we can wonder whether Jesus referenced an earlier tradition or whether the Talmud is referencing Jesus' argument, which is kind of fun to think about. So the context here is a priest who is called to testify as he's preparing a sacrifice. The priest is called to testify to the innocent of one accused from a capital crime, even though he's right in the middle of making that sacrifice. And the thought is he has to go. He has to do this. And the quote is, just as a priest is taken from the temple service in order to save a life, and temple service overrides Shabbat, so too saving a life overrides Shabbat. Rabbi Eliezer answered and said, just as the mitzvah, the command of circumcision, overrides Shabbat, so too saving one's whole body overrides Shabbat. I just think that's fascinating. We've got this exact A, B, C, A is greater than C argument right here in the Talmud. And so we have some confirmation, I think, that this is what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying nearly identical. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Mark gives us a little bit more context here. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So no gospel writer records any rebuttal from the group of Pharisees. There's no side comment. There's no questioning. There's a legal maxim, qui tacit consentit. It means silence gives consent, or silence gives agreement. So anytime there's something said and you don't rebut it, it's an unrebutted a statement that you agree with it. Therefore, I tend to give the Pharisees the benefit of the doubt. I conclude that they were satisfied and maybe had their lives changed by Jesus' simple argument. So let's try and give the benefit of the doubt wherever we can. Our memory verse here, Shabbat was made for man and not man for Shabbat. Now, as Gentiles, we don't typically observe Shabbat, but I would encourage us, it's a gift the Father gave to his people. So I encourage each of us to spend some time and understand why it's a gift and why it is included in the Ten Commandments. But over and above that, understanding this incident in the grain fields is central to understanding each of Jesus's Sabbath conflicts with the authorities. And my conclusion is he believed human compassion takes precedence over ceremonial concerns, and that God values this. He values compassion over following rules. He didn't trivialize the Sabbath, because on every other day when there wasn't an emergency or a need to heal or do anything like that, he observed Sabbath, and he was very careful about it. But his aim here is to restore a balanced perspective that prioritizes human needs. And in a way, these conflicts where we've got 200 some odd Sabbaths where nothing happened, and yet we've got these limited number of questions and healings and whatnot, this actually demonstrates the Sabbath's importance. He did not dismiss it or teach his disciples to disregard it. He taught them to hold it to the highest degrees of specificity. Departing from there, and Luke says on another Sabbath, so not the same day, he went into their synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered, and they questioned Jesus, asking, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" so that they might bring charges against him. Now here, obviously, Pharisees clearly wanted to entrap Jesus, but so the text tells us here this is an entrapment situation, not a legitimate inquiry. Remember, this is a segment of the Pharisees. John 9:16 reminds us that they were split in their opinion. Some said he was a Sabbath breaker. Some said, now, if he did that, he'd be sinning, and he's not a sinner. So there are many different splinter groups under the blanket title of Pharisees, just like we have many different Baptist denominations. I saw one website that counted 22 different Baptist denominations, each with different beliefs and faith statements, but all of them falling under the title of Baptists. A question maybe we could ask is flip it around. Why do the gospel writers add so that they might entrap or accuse him only in certain places and not everywhere? And my suspicion is because not every encounter with the Pharisees was hostile. Only those that were hostile do they add this statement so that they might find reason to accuse him. Now, I'm not here to defend or apologize for the Pharisees. I do want us to get in the habit of reading the biblical text for what it says, and at times what it says is quite different from what we think it says. I think from time to time we act like the accusing Pharisees. We're pointing fingers at them. But remember, the law of pointing is when I point my finger at someone else, there are three more pointing back at me. This reminds me of the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee, and each is praying out loud. The tax collector says, "Have mercy on me, a sinner," while the Pharisee says, "Thank God I'm not like this tax collector." And if we're honest, our response is usually something like, "Well, thank God I'm not like this Pharisee." And we don't even realize that our own self-righteous and condemning words sound exactly like the Pharisees' words. So we fall into acting like self-righteous Pharisees more often than we may want to admit. Luke clearly tells us that this is a different Sabbath, and I would say we don't necessarily have to conclude that the Pharisees in the withered hand episode are the same ones from the grainfield episode. In fact, they're probably not. Arguments back and forth in the Jewish writings indicate that there was not a consensus decision regarding limits on specific behaviors. And so I think in Jesus' day, the faction that argued for narrow interpretation of what was allowable, they may have wanted to assert their authority, and Jesus is challenging and correcting that. In reality, this may have had a lot less to do with what was or wasn't allowed on a Sabbath, but really more about dealing with Jesus' growing popularity, which is threatening to upset the balance. And so they're using the Sabbath as a pretense to do other things. This picture of a synagogue was excavated in Galilee, and then it was transported stone by stone to Kiryat Yearim, and it's outside Jerusalem, and it's in a place that I loved to visit called the Yad HaShemona Biblical Gardens. In fact, this place was our very first stop on our recent Israel tour. And when I say first stop, not only did we stop at the gardens, we stopped in the synagogue, was our first teaching. Here is where the guides introduced themselves and the teachers introduced themselves. And our first teaching was They Forgot God. And we read 1 Samuel 4 through 7, and the whole story about losing the ark. They forgot to bring the ark ark into battle, and then they lose the ark into battle, and then eventually the ark is returned right to this location, and you can read about that in 1 Samuel chapter 7. And so this "don't forget God" becomes a theme for our tour, and really, if we're honest, it's a theme for our lives, because we get caught up in our day-to-day and our busyness and good things and as well as bad things, but we forget God along the way. But he said to them, "What man is there among you who has a sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will he not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable then is a person than a sheep? So then, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." So in part 1, we looked at this coal of the Homer argument, light to heavy. If we do something that is light, rescuing a sheep from a pit on Shabbat, how much more should we do something that is heavy, like restoring a person to health on Shabbat? So what Jesus is doing here is he's elevating any act of human compassion as a positive command on the Sabbath. And so here he's prioritizing compassion. I think before he was prioritizing love, and here he's prioritizing compassion. Any time is the right time for an act of human compassion. So for one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, for him it is sin. James 4:17. Proverbs 3:27-28. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, "Go and come back tomorrow, I will give it to you," when you have it with you. So I think, in what ways do we get caught up in our busyness that we might verbally or non-verbally tell someone in need, "Come back tomorrow"? Any time is the right time to do a positive, good deed for someone. We tend to have the show must go on mentality, and we rigidly stick to our schedules, but sometimes we need to let ourselves be interrupted by the need to help someone in need. Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and it was restored to normal like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him as to how they might destroy him. So Mark gives us an interesting aside here. He says he grieved at the hardness of their hearts. I think Jesus wanted to engage in dialogue. He would rather have had the question that the Pharisees in the field asked, "What are you doing? Is this not lawful?" And that would have given him an opportunity to dig into this deeper. But here the scripture tells us that this group of Pharisees is being passive aggressive. We're told that they went out and plotted. So here I'm fully on board that these Pharisees are up to no good. Since this exchange took place in front of the entire congregation, they probably didn't appreciate, being shown up like this. Mark also adds they conspired with the Herodians, which is interesting because any other time the Pharisees would have had nothing to do with the immoral Herodians. They were wealthy, secular, and had nothing to do. They didn't have anything to do with each other. This is truly the art of war. The enemy of my enemy is now my friend, because John the Baptist was put in prison by Herod Antipas, and so if Jesus somehow suffered the same fate, life would have been good for this group of bad guys here. So remember our quote that we talked about last time. Jesus is not overturning the Sabbath, but he demands instead a different way to understand and apply it. Remember, the Sabbath is a gift from God to his people. And I would add, there's nothing that says you have to be Jewish to observe it. It's in the Ten Commandments, and the Ten Commandments are for everyone. You don't have to be Jewish not to murder, right? You don't have to be Jewish to love God with your whole heart and serve him alone. Note what Isaiah says here. This is a promise that we can claim, just like many of us claim 2 Chronicles 7:14, that be the famous statement that says, "If my people are called by my name." This is another if-then statement, just like 2 Chronicles is. "If because of the Sabbath you restrain your foot from doing as you wish on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a pleasure, and the holy day of the Lord honorable, and honor it, desisting from your own ways, and from seeking your own pleasure, and speaking your own word, then you will take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." So may we get into the habit of setting aside a full 24 hours for God. A lot of us would say Sunday is our Sabbath, or Sunday is the Christian Sabbath, but do we really set aside a full day, or is it just a couple of hours in the morning? We need to set aside our own ways. We need to set aside things we'd rather be doing. God wants to hear from us. He put Sabbath as a weekly time. It's like an appointment on the calendar to meet with him. And we should not view this as a got to, but it's a get to. And as Isaiah says here, take delight in the Lord. That's the purpose of the Sabbath. So I pray this lesson has given us a fresh perspective on Shabbat. And again, think about that Isaiah passage, meditate on it, and just how beautiful it is and what God's intent for the Sabbath is versus what man turns it into. So maybe we can play a part in restoring the Sabbath just as Jesus set the example for here. So with that thought, I bid you Shabbat Shalom, and that's the greeting that Hebrew-speaking Jews will give to each other on anytime Friday, really, and all day Saturday. It means a peaceful and fulfilling Sabbath rest. So no matter what day of the week you're watching or listening to this, I greet you with Shabbat Shalom. Next time we'll look at the chapter is called the 12, and we'll look at the 12 disciples, and we're going to see how they're bringing trouble, like the song from The Chosen says. So we'll see you next time.